Hi, welcome to the Blue Screen Brothers. I still have Marius with me because we are doing a second part of our app registration walkthrough, deep dive and fun stuff. And we need you guys to look in episode 1, so we are giving you a 20 minutes pause while you are watching that episode, right?
Yes.
Or should you just sum it up, Marius?
I can summarize it a little bit, but to get sort of all the why we're here background, look at episode 1. So what we did in episode 1 was to configure a multi-tenant application and accessing it from a tenant called Westeros. However, the app registration is in a tenant called Good Workaround Dev. Then we did some fiddling around with where we're signing in, meaning that we had some. First of all, we signed into this common endpoint, meaning that we reach our home tenant essentially and sign in from there. And we saw that we were able to sign in, and we then changed the URL. So we actually forced sort of the login to happen to this 237 tenant, and this is the Good Workaround Dev tenant instead. And what happens when we try to sign in with an account from another tenant to that endpoint is that we got this MFA prompt. And let's talk a bit about why. So let's look at what has happened in our tenant that we try to sign into, this 237 tenant, Good Workaround Dev. So let's just refresh on our user blade and find our users. So now we should be able to see a user here, mod administrator, as a guest. So this is the one trying to sign in. We might even be able to see the sign-in log as an interrupted sign-in, but I'm not sure. Yeah, poor example. So essentially, it has accepted the invite, but it got a prompt for go ahead and register MFA. And the reason is that we are now signing into this tenant, and there's a conditional access policy somewhere that enforces the MFA, or it could even be security defaults that is in action. We're not going to dive into conditional access, but we're going to dive into the just to sort of understand the sign-in part here. So the thing is that when this user signs in, by default, the multifactor authentication will need to happen on the guest account. And we or our tenant also by default doesn't trust any external tenants. So it says, no, go ahead. You need to register your MFA on this guest placeholder account. And that can be useful in certain circumstances, but it's management hell, to be honest. Because what will happen is that you will have a guest signing into your apps, and then suddenly they lose their phone, and then they need to call your IT to get their MFA essentially reset. That's under authentication methods and require re-register multi-factor authentication. So someone actually has to go into the guest account and do that. And that is so cumbersome.
Yeah.
So instead, what we can do is that we can use a somewhat new feature. It's not brand new, but it's under external identities and cross-tenant access settings. So what this does is that I can add, first of all, default settings for any tenant, or I can add organization-specific settings. So if we look at the default settings first, so inbound access settings, which is what we're talking about here, because we are now in let's call it the service provider tenant, this Good Workaround Dev tenant, where the application actually is because we are adding this to the URL, meaning that we want to sign into this tenant. But then that means that I am sort of an inbound guest, essentially. And here we can see that the default settings is that we do not trust multi-factor authentication from Microsoft Entra tenants. I also do not trust compliant devices or hybrid join devices or that status from other tenants by default. And often it can be actually a good idea to have this enabled by default, but some don't really want to do that. And there's reasons.
The trouble with that is if I create a new tenant and turn on MFA and I'm a bad guy, you will trust me because I have used the MFA setting in my bad tenant, but it's still an Entra tenant. So
yes, and that is a whole discussion, right? Because is it a problem? Because he still needs to actually have access granted to the different services and things, right? So there's reasons to enable, there are reasons to not enable. But let's now look at organizational settings. So because I can now add my other tenant where we try to sign in from. So that's this tenant, this yellow tenant, Westeros. So I can now add this tenant as an organization. So as you can see, it now looks up Westeros, finds the tenant ID, and we can click add. So now we have added essentially custom organizational settings for that particular tenant. So here we can go into inbound access again. And here we can go to trust settings and customize. So essentially we can say that for this tenant, we actually trust multi-factor authentication rather than requiring all users to register in our tenants. So we can click save.
What would happen if Westeros didn't have MFA enabled as a requirement?
Yeah, that is a good question. And that is that you will need to register in our tenants, essentially.
Yeah, because it still would require an MFA token to be allowed in as long as you have a conditional access saying that you need multi-factor authentication. So
Yep, absolutely. So oops. So essentially now I save this and then I'm finding my charger. So now with that, we've saved these trust settings where we have trusted multi-factor authentication for our other tenant. Let's jump to that tenant that we trusted. So now we're back in Westeros and we can again take this URL where we essentially force that we are going to sign into this tenant. As you can, and again, as you can see, 237, a different tenant from where we are. Let's go. So what happened now? Need admin approval. The reason, so as you might, or if you did watch episode 1, then you would have seen that we chose only to accept or approve as ourselves in this other tenant, Good Workaround Dev. So if we now go to our app registration, let's find it. We called it Magic Portal. This. So under API permissions, and now we need to dig into this a little bit because as you can see here now, this is the current API permissions available for the application. But you will see that admin consent request required is no. So, okay, it shouldn't require an admin consent. However, guests will require it anyway. this is where we can now look a bit into the permissions here. So what is it that we are actually trying to do? Well, when we try to sign in, we have this scope. So the scope has a few options on how you configure it. As you can see here, currently we have this strange graph.microsoft.com/.default value. You see the %2f, which is slash. And that essentially means that it tries to take all the permissions essentially that it has available when signing in as a user. And when you sign in as a user, it's the type here for delegated is what is actually valid or actually used essentially. So it will try to get all the permissions from that has delegated permissions. We can actually add more by going to add a permission, choose the APIs, for example, Microsoft Graph, which is the biggest one on the top, where we can add additional API permissions. But the reason why we cannot sign in currently is that we have essentially only consented to this as an admin for that particular user and not our organization. Because what we're trying to do now, and this is where it sort of becomes a bit complicated in the process where you want to have B2B guests signing into your apps, because my guest from Westeros is actually trying to sign into Good Workaround Dev. So all policies from Good Workaround Dev is what is actually applied, and that is also true for the permissions and everything. And since there's no default consent available for guests, I will need to grant an admin consent for that. And what is actually happening now is that I have essentially said for any user in my organization, including the guests that I have, that this delegated user.read, which means that you can sign in and read the user profile, is allowed. And you can also see that the API is Microsoft Graph, and that's the same thing that we see here. It's just different representations. So when we do that, we should be allowed to do this. So as you can see, now we're in. And so let's open one more tab. Let's take this other URL as well. So let's also open this that has common. Let's do that too, like this. So of course they are different because the content is a bit different. But you will notice one thing here. Have a look at the issuer. So here it's this 237 value, and here it's 4A9. So it's a different issuer. And an issuer here means essentially which Entra tenant have you signed into. So I'm actually in both circumstances signed in as this admin at this tenant here. It's always nice to have these nice names. And you can see that's true for both of them. You can actually see that this where we sign in as a guest doesn't have a UPN. That's interesting. But you can see that it's the same value for the unique name here. However, the issuer is different. But then again, IDP, well, that's so identity provider. That's something else again. So there's many properties in the JWT payload here to consider, and this is sort of where we cannot dive too deeply into how to actually do that in your apps. But the important thing is that the issuer here, which is the OpenID Connect standards claim, I believe IDP is not part of that. So the issuer is actually the the tenant that you have signed into. So when we forced our way through this tenant, that's our issuer. However, if we go to common, which was this other tab, that's where we see this 4A9 value instead, which is our home tenant. So we actually sign into the app in two different ways. And this was actually a recent discovered security hole, essentially, in Entra ID. So the thing is that no, that's actually false to say. It's not recently or discovered at all. It has always been the way, and it's been by design. But the thing is that you can here also issue email as a value. So I have now, I believe I did that in one of them, didn't I? Yeah, I have email here. Is it here as well? I don't think so. Yeah, exactly. So the thing is that when I sign in here and have this email, now this value here actually stems from the wrong tenant, sort of. This is on the guest account, and you have options here that where I can now in the tenant where I have invited the guest, I will have this placeholder user, right? That you should handle somehow. This mod administrator, which is invited, and this is possible to edit. And here I can modify, for example, email. So certain applications, and this is sort of a no-no, rely on email as a field for determining which user is actually signing in. And you should never do that, because this is possible to issue from another tenant. As you can see here, I can actually, so when I sign into this 237, which is not my home tenant, that tenant can issue my email value, but it's possible to edit in the 237 tenant, so I can issue another value for the same user. And there's a whole bunch of things that you need to be aware of. So
you can actually pretend to be another user in the same tenant.
That you are or in another tenant even.
Yeah, so you can fake your identities if your application use only the email as a provider for who you are instead of the different other solutions. Yeah.
So the values you should use to identify a user is a mix of issuer, OID, or sub. So OID, that's the object ID of the user. And what you will actually see here, let's look at this OID value here. So in one of them, it's 618, and the other, it's 859. And why is that? Well, that's because when we sign into through the other tenant, essentially, we sign in as our guest account. So if we look here in this 237 tenant and find our mod administrator account, we'll actually see this same 859 object ID on the guest account. So this now means that this is another user than when we sign in through the multi-tenant approach. This subject field, which looks very random, is not random. It is just that it's unique per application, per user. So I will always have the same value in sub for a certain application. However, if we were to add Magic Portal 2 as an app and sign into that with the same user, I will have a different value in the sub, meaning subject, in the subject claim here, while my OID value will be the same. So here there are sort of things that need to be handled when working with multiple APIs or integrations between apps and things like that, where you should always use the sub if you can, but in certain circumstances you can't, because you need to be able to essentially know that this and this is the same user. But if you, for example, have a front end and a back end where you have an ID token for your front end and an access token for your back end, they will have a different value in the sub claim. So that can be more difficult to handle in certain circumstances. But that is sort of a design thing that you need to think about when adding or when implementing Entra ID authentication for your applications and APIs.
Yeah.
So yeah, this was fairly complex, I would say, but we talked a bit about this, so how multi-tenant and single-tenant apps work, and what happens when you sign in across tenants, and how you can trust tenants, invite people, and
how
everything.
the token works.
Yes, exactly.
So then I guess this is the rollup for this episode, but we are still going to talk more about application registration, right?
We are going to do that because if you have a keen eye, you will have seen that on the app registration page, we have plenty of other options that we need to talk about. We haven't.
So we'll see you at the next episode.
Okay, I'm stopped.
Yeah. Perfect. Yes. So see you around in next episode.
See you.
See you.